My official title is Waste Stream Analyst. It's the kind of name a committee invents to give a garbage man a sliver of dignity he never asked for. I call myself a salvage artist. My work for orbital reclamation and logistics, the bureaucratic hydra that signs my paychecks, is a means to an end. They send me, in my scow, a one-man industrial vehicle that's two software updates from obsolescence, to sift through the galaxy's trash. I hunt for specified alloys and composites. But what I'm really looking for is beauty. For 32 years, my life has been a study in the gap between vision and execution. I can see the sublime curve in a piece of scorched freighter hull, the tragic elegance in a shattered drone. I see the art, but my hands can only document it, never create it. My apartment on Port Xylos is a monument to this failure. A carefully curated gallery of potential that I am too afraid to touch, too terrified I will ruin. The rejection letter from the Cygnus X1 Institute of Aesthetic Design is the first thing I see when I wake, and the last thing I see before I sleep. Extraordinary vision, but technically deficient. A 4-word summary of my soul. My shift today took me to Rubble Field 904, an officially designated graveyard for a corporate skirmish nobody remembers. The scow's manipulator arms, extensions of my own hands, sorted through the wreckage. A shattered security drone from Xenocorp, its shell cracked like fine porcelain. A web of wiring from a comms relay, a fossilized nervous system. It was all a familiar and beautiful ruin. I was cataloguing a section of warped plating when a new alert appeared on my console. A null signal. My eyes went to the mass spec readout. The numbers were flat. The scanner, which was calibrated to identify the composition of any matter down to the molecular level, reported nothing. It was a void in the data where an object clearly was. My gaze shifted to the main viewer. The external camera zoomed, pixels resolving. There, nestled in a cradle of twisted metal, was a cube. It was small, something I could close my hand around. And it was red. Not painted red, but a deep, fundamental redness. I pushed the joystick forward, guiding the pincer of the main manipulator arm closer. The twisted scrap around it was a lamentation of shattered steel. The cube was a note of pure, unwavering silence. My eyes tracked along one edge. The line was absolute. My focus shifted to a corner where 3 planes met. The geometry was a law of physics made solid. I ran a low-power laser scan, searching for a tool mark, a microscopic seam, a single flaw in its surface. The return was obscenely precise. Nothing is this perfect. Not things that are made, and not things that are grown. The company manual had a clear procedure for non-valuable, unidentified anomalies. Log coordinates, tag, and bypass for later incineration. It was a liability. It was worthless. My hand moved to the control panel, bypassing the log entry command. I keyed the override for the cargo manifest. A few taps on the screen, and the scow's record for the next 60 seconds would be blank. The manipulator arm's pincers, designed for crushing and sorting tons of metal, closed around the cube with a delicacy I had to program in myself. The arm retracted, bypassing the main reclamation furnace and the sorted material bay. It deposited the object into the small, shielded compartment behind my pilot's chair, the one place I kept my personal effects. The only place the company scanners didn't check. I did not know what it was. I did not know its origin or its purpose. But I knew that I held something that was not broken. It was whole. It was complete. And I was taking it home. The trip back to Port Xylos was a standard burn against the station's orbital velocity. The scow's autopilot handled the navigation, leaving my mind free to cycle through the implications of the object stowed behind me. It was a blank spot in a universe of data, a flaw in the code of reality. My collection back home was a library of beautiful failures. This cube was something else entirely. It was an answer to a question I'd never thought to ask. Docking Bay 7 received my scow. The magnetic clamps engaged, and the pressure seals finalized their connection to the umbilical. My screen displayed the post-flight checklist. Cargo manifest uploaded. Fuel cells nominal. Life support standby. All green. My hand moved to the latch on the shielded compartment. I retrieved the cube. In the low light of the cockpit, its redness was a living color, deep and absolute. It had no discernible weight, not heavy or light, just a presence in my palm. I secured it inside a thermal wrap, the kind used for transporting sensitive components, and tucked it into the inner pocket of my work jacket. Stepping out of the scow, I walked the length of the gantry. I passed a few other haulers ending their shifts. Heads down, shoulders slumped. We never spoke. We were all just ghosts in the same machine. The transit tube carried me from the industrial ring, a zone of constant commerce and branded advertisements, out to the shell. The shell is where the station houses its labor, a crust of mass-produced residential blocks bolted to the exterior. My stop was Block 7C, a vertical slab of habitation units managed by a superintendent named Frank and an automated system that handled everything else. The corridor to my apartment was empty. Privacy is the highest law in these blocks. Curiosity is a dangerous crime. No one looks, no one asks. It's how I've been able to maintain my collection without a single notice from management. My door slid open, granting me access to my sanctuary. Class G Habitation Unit, the lease agreement called it. I called it my museum. The metal quarter rose to my left, stacks of warped girders and twisted plating, arranged into what I thought of as monuments to collapse. Straight ahead, the polymer wing, with its cascades of faded synth fabrics and the iridescent carapaces of beetle drones. To my right, the circuitry archive, a delicate tangle of dead data chips and fried motherboards. It was my life's work. My eyes moved across the room, searching for the right place. This new object didn't belong among the broken things. It was not an elegy of decay. It was something else. I settled on a small, empty plinth in the center of the room. It was a single, polished block of obsidian I'd salvaged from the wreck of a luxury yacht years ago. It was the one piece I had ever found that was almost whole. I unwrapped the cube. The red of its surface seemed to push against the muted tones of my collection. I placed it on the obsidian plinth. The contrast was severe. The perfect form of the cube against the chaotic, fractured beauty of everything I had ever loved. It felt like a judgment. For a long time, I just stood there, watching it. The cube did nothing. It was a silent crimson period at the end of a long, rambling sentence. I ran a systems diagnostic on my apartment's environmental controls. Power draw was normal. No atmospheric changes, no radiation. It was just an object, an inert, flawless piece of matter. I moved to the sustenance alcove, initiated the sequence for a nutrient packet, and consumed its contents without tasting them. My eyes kept drifting back to the red cube on its black pedestal. It was the centerpiece of my collection now, the king of my scrapyard kingdom. I dimmed the main illuminator, leaving only a single low light on the cube, and moved to my sleeping alcove. Lying down, I closed my eyes, but the image of that perfect, silent shape was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. It was the last thing I saw. A low chime from the chronometer pulled me from a sleep deeper than any I had known. My eyes opened. The ceiling was not the flat, institutional grey I had seen every morning for the past 8 years. It was a slow, silent vortex of deep indigo woven with threads of gold. The light in the room was not coming from the standard illuminator panel. It was being emitted by the ceiling itself, a soft, living radiance that settled on every surface at once. I sat up, swept the room. It was not my room. It was remade. The metal quarter to my left was gone. In its place stood a single towering sculpture. The warped girders and stressed plating were no longer a pile of junk. They were intertwined, flowing into one another to form a structure that drew the eye upward. It was a column of frozen motion, capturing the exact moment of a catastrophe and turning it into an act of grace. My focus shifted to the polymer wing. The iridescent beetle drone carapaces, dozens of them, were no longer in a bin. They now clung to the wall in a vast mosaic, their colors shifting in the strange light. They formed a spiral, a perfect logarithmic pattern that mimicked the arms of a galaxy. Each piece was set at a precise angle to its neighbors, the whole arrangement creating a sense of depth that made the wall seem to recede into infinity. My legs moved, carrying me out of the sleeping alcove. My bare feet met the floor. It was no longer cold composite. It felt like polished stone, but warm, with fine silvery lines running through it in a pattern like cracked ice. The circuitry archive, my collection of fossilized machine nervous systems, had been incorporated into it. The dead data chips were now the silver lines. My hand went out, tracing the surface of the nearest sculpture, the one made from the remains of a Xenocorp security drone. The join between two pieces of its fractured shell was non-existent. It was not a weld. It was not a seam. The two components flowed into one another as if they had grown that way. The composition, the balance, the flawless execution, my mind, the mind of a failed artist, analyzed it with a speed and clarity that was its own form of pain. This was genius. This was a level of artistry I could not even properly critique, only witness. A clean thought formed in my mind, sharp as a shard of glass. The cube did this. My head turned, eyes snapping to the center of the room, to the black obsidian plinth. The red cube was still there. It sat in the same spot, but it was no longer just red. The color was deeper, and within its flawless surface, microscopic points of other colors. A searing blue, a vibrant green, a pure yellow, shifted and swirled like captured starlight. It had taken my collection. It had taken my life's work, my beautiful, broken things, and it had finished them. It had effortlessly accomplished what I had spent a decade failing to even begin. There was no joy in this revelation. There was only the quiet finality of a verdict being handed down. The awe I felt was crushed by the weight of a profound, soul-deep jealousy. I was a curator in a museum built by a god who had used my own bricks. My eyes left the cube and found my own reflection in the polished surface of a nearby sculpture. The face looking back was mine, but the expression was one I had never seen before. It was the face of a man who had just become obsolete. I raised my hand to my face and stopped. I held it up in the soft light. The calluses were still there, the scars from 1,000 cuts on rough metal. But it was different. The slight tremor that had plagued me my entire life, the subtle lack of coordination that made every precise drawing a frustrating failure, was gone. My hand was perfectly still. It felt less like a part of my body and more like a tool I had just picked up for the first time. I walked over to my work slate, a small datapad I used for sketching ideas I would never complete. I picked up the stylus. I did it without thinking. My eyes fell upon the sculpture of intertwined girders. I saw its core structure, its lines of force, its aesthetic logic. And my hand moved. The stylus flew across the surface of the slate. There was no hesitation, no shaky lines. In under a minute, a perfect two-dimensional rendering of the sculpture appeared on the screen. A flawless architectural drawing, complete with complex shading and perspective. I stared at the sketch. The skill was not mine. It had been installed. The violation of my home was nothing. That was external. This was a trespass of a different order entirely. The anomaly was no longer just in the room. It was in my blood and my bones. It was looking out through my eyes. For 2 full days, I did not leave the apartment. I did not eat. I did not report for my shift, an act that would trigger an automatic pay deduction and a formal demerit. It didn't matter. The world outside my door had ceased to have any relevance. My universe was now this single, enclosed space. I moved through the gallery my home had become, my hand trailing against surfaces that were not built but composed. I spent hours staring at the cube, watching the nebulae of colour drift within its depths, trying to discern a logic, a purpose. There was none I could grasp. My time was spent in a fever of verification. I drew, I filled the work slate with sketches. Anatomical studies of alien fauna I'd only ever glimpsed in data files. Architectural renderings of buildings that defied gravity. Portraits of faces from my memory rendered with a precision that felt like a theft of their souls. The skill flowed out of my hand, a current from an unknown source. My mind could now hold a three-dimensional object, rotate it, disassemble it, and understand its every component. The part of my brain that had once housed a deep, frustrating fog was now a perfectly calibrated machine. I was a passenger in my own body. The act of creation produced its own form of waste. Empty nutrient packets, the discarded packaging from a new set of precision styluses I'd ordered, the foil wrap from a block of raw modelling composite. The bin was full, a mundane problem intruding on a metaphysical crisis. The automated building system was unforgiving. Missing a scheduled waste disposal meant a fine. My mind was still tracing the lines of a sculpture made from woven light when I picked up the bag. I moved to the door. The corridor outside had a single shared disposal chute at its midpoint. I cycled the door open. The flat light of the hallway felt abrasive after the soft radiance of my apartment. I stepped out, my attention fixed on the chute 50 feet away. My door began to slide shut behind me. It was in that 2-second interval, the time it takes for the mechanism to engage and close, that a figure shuffling down the hall entered my peripheral vision. I recognized the shape. A resident from a few doors down. A data clerk, I think. A man whose defining feature was his complete lack of any. He was in his usual slump, his eyes fixed on the floor ahead of him. Then, through the closing gap of my doorway, his head lifted. His pace faltered. He stopped. His body went rigid, his posture straightening as if pulled upright by an invisible wire. His face, which I had never properly seen before, was turned towards the sliver of my apartment that was visible. His eyes were wide. His mouth fell open. A circuit in my head broke. My hand shot back, slamming against the closing door, trying to force it shut faster. The servo motors whined in protest. I threw my shoulder into it, and the door sealed with a solid thud. My back was pressed against the composite, the slight vibration of the building's systems travelling through it into my spine. I looked through the tiny, wide-angle lens of my door's external security feed, displayed on the small panel next to the lock. The man, Orion Fisher, according to the tenant manifest that briefly flashed on screen, was still standing there. He wasn't moving. He was staring at my door. He took a slow, hesitant step closer, then another. He raised a hand as if to shield his eyes from a light that was no longer there. The expression on his face was not confusion. It was not fear. I had spent my life studying art, and I knew that look. It was the look of pure, unadulterated reverence, the look of an atheist who had just seen a god. He stood there for a full minute, a statue in the empty corridor. Then he slowly backed away, his eyes never leaving my door, as if turning his back on it would be an act of blasphemy. He retreated to his own unit and disappeared inside. The security feed showed an empty hallway again, but it was not the same. The barrier of anonymity that had protected me for years had been breached. The seal was broken. Someone else had seen. My private miracle, my private horror, was no longer my own. I stood there, my back to the door, the bag of waste still clutched in my fist. The plastic crinkled, a sound that was suddenly too loud in the silent gallery. The disposal chute was a risk now. The hallway was enemy territory. My mind supplied the tactical assessment. The distance was 50 feet. No cover. One visible neighbour. Now a variable I could not predict. I opened the door a second time, just enough to slip through, and palmed it shut behind me. The corridor stretched out, its flat lighting erasing all shadows, leaving no place to hide. At the chute, in a single, efficient motion, I dropped the bag into the void. I did not wait for the hiss of the vacuum seal. I was already moving back, sweeping the length of the hall, checking every door for a hint of movement behind a privacy lens. Only when my own door was sealed behind me did the tension in my shoulders ease by a fraction. The next day began with a soft scraping sound at my door. I was awake. I had been sitting on the floor watching the shifts of color within the cube, my own internal systems running on a high, anxious current. The sound pulled my focus instantly to the security feed. It was him, Orion Fisher. He was crouched, his body angled as if to shield his actions from the corridor's unseen eyes. He carefully placed a small, dark object on the floor, directly in front of my door's threshold. His movements were filled with a caution that bordered on ritual. He did not touch the door. He simply set down his offering, paused for a moment with his head bowed, and then rose and walked away with that same shuffling, downcast gait, his purpose fulfilled. My screen identified the object. It was a small, cast-iron gear, its teeth perfectly spaced, its form a simple, honest piece of industrial design. Symmetrical. Whole. It was an object he must have found, something he recognized as having a kind of order, a humble echo of the beauty he had glimpsed. It sat on the floor outside my door. A marker. An invitation for anyone. Frank, the superintendent, a curious neighbor, a maintenance drone, to stop and ask a question. Why is this here? I could not leave it. I watched the empty corridor on the feed for 3 full minutes. I timed the interval between the automated sweeps of the cleaning drones. I mapped the angles from the neighboring doors. When the corridor was clear, I moved. I didn't open the door fully. I disengaged the magnetic lock and slid it open just enough for my arm to fit through the gap. My hand shot out, my fingers closing around the gear. I retracted my arm, the gear safe in my palm, and sealed the door. The entire operation took less than 4 seconds. I stood in the center of my transformed apartment, the small machine part in my hand. It was an act of worship. And I, the unwilling prophet, had just accepted my first tithe. I placed the gear on my work slate. It had no place among the new pantheon of sculptures. To put it there would feel like a priest placing a child's crayon drawing on the main altar. It was a humble thing, an honest piece of industrial design with no pretense, and it belonged in the human world. My world. The one that no longer existed in this room. The next few days settled into a silent siege. My existence contracted to the perimeter of my apartment and the narrow view of the corridor on my security feed. I watched Orion Fisher. His routine was unchanged. He left for his shift. He returned. But now he moved with the gravity of a secret pilgrim. He never looked directly at my door again. It was as if the first glance had been so potent, he feared a second would unmake him. Another offering appeared. A single flower with petals the color of a deep space nebula held in a small water bladder. It was a biological audacity in the manufactured world of Block 7C, a luxury item that would have cost a data clerk a significant portion of his pay. I retrieved it with the same swift motion as the gear, a thief stealing prayers left for him. I placed it next to the gear on my work slate. A piece of a machine, a piece of a life form. 2 simple, perfect things in a room full of alien complexity. The real trouble started on the block-wide comms channel. It was a public feed, mostly used for automated announcements from Frank about maintenance schedules and the occasional shared post about a lost item. Then, a new kind of message began to appear, posted from Orion Fisher's public identifier. He wrote about light that sings. He wrote about walls that breathe. The language was frantic, disjointed, the work of a man trying to describe a new color to a world that had only ever seen grey. Most residents ignored it. The posts were met with digital silence or a curt, wrong channel from a neighbor. But the posts kept coming, They were a signal flare of madness launched from the corridor outside my door. I knew it was only a matter of time. The system abhors an anomaly. It is designed to identify and correct anything that does not compute. And Orion, in his desperate public worship, was becoming a glaring error. The correction came via my main terminal. A red flag appeared over the icon for my official building inbox. It was a notification from the superintendent's office, a message from Frank. It was brief, composed in the efficient language of bureaucracy. Subject: Unit 7C12, Occupant Wellness Inquiry. Mr. Clark, due to recent reports regarding erratic commentary originating from your floor and noting your multi-cycle absence from your registered work duties, we are required to conduct an unscheduled wellness check. Expect a visit from me within the next 24 hours to ensure your compliance with block residency statutes and to verify the operational status of your unit's standard equipment. My focus collapsed from the entire apartment to the glowing text on the screen. He was coming to look. He was coming to see if my ceiling was a ceiling, if my walls were walls. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. They were coming inside. The abstract threat of discovery had collapsed into a concrete deadline. I pushed back from the terminal, my chair gliding over the floor woven with dead circuitry. I scanned the room, but not as a curator admiring his collection. I saw it as Frank would see it, as evidence. The ceiling was a violation of municipal lighting statutes. The walls were an unauthorized structural modification. The floor was a blatant misuse of recycled materials. The sculptures themselves? Unregistered artifacts of unknown origin. A clear breach of the Class G Habitation Unit Lease Agreement, Clause 4, Subsection B. Each masterpiece was another nail in my coffin. Options flashed through my mind, a frantic, useless inventory of impossibilities. I could cover everything. Throw synth fabric over the sculptures, but how do you throw a sheet over a ceiling that glows? I could run, abandon the apartment, but to where? All my data, my identity, was tied to this unit, this job. To leave would be to erase myself. There was only one source, one agent of change in this room. I turned and faced the obsidian plinth. The chroma cube sat there, the quiet center of the storm, the colors inside it churning with cosmic indifference. For days, I had been its audience, its subject, a passive recipient of its terrifying, beautiful gift. Now, I had to be something else. I walked toward it, each step an effort of will. I stopped before the plinth, a supplicant approaching an altar. What language do you use to speak to a thing that rewrites physics as a form of interior design? How do you explain the concept of a building superintendent to a god? You have to hide this, I said. The words came out as a whisper, swallowed by the silence of the room. All of it. The cube did not respond. The colors swirled. I tried again, desperation sharpening my voice. Someone is coming. A man. He enforces the rules. He won't understand. I gestured around the room, a wild sweep of my arm. All of this is a violation. It's not allowed. He will see it, and he will report it. They'll take you away. They'll take me away. I was pleading with it, trying to translate the mundane threat of bureaucratic reprisal into a language it might comprehend. Threat, danger, loss. Did it understand these things? Make it normal again, I begged. Just for a little while. Make it look like it did before. The grey walls, the flat ceiling. Just for a day. Please. My hands were clenched into fists at my sides. I was staring into its flawless surface, searching for any sign of comprehension, any hint of change. Nothing. It was a perfect object, deaf to my terror. It didn't care, it didn't understand. It had remade my world, and now it was going to let that new world destroy me. I stood there for a long time, the hope draining out of me, leaving behind the certainty of my own doom. Then, a change in the room. In the sculpture to my left, the one made of woven light, One of the strands of light dimmed, faded, and went out. Then another. The process was slow, like a mind considering a request, and then, piece by piece, beginning to grant it. The light didn't just go out, it unraveled. The strand retracted into itself, a thread of pure energy being rewound onto an invisible spool. Then another followed, and another. The sculpture of woven light disassembled itself strand by strand, its complex form collapsing into nothingness with a final pop, leaving a void where it had stood. It wasn't just hiding it. It was erasing it. The great mosaic of beetle drone carapaces on the far wall began to vibrate. With a collective click, each piece detached and fell in a controlled cascade, landing in the exact same pile in the corner where I had kept them. The wall behind it, which had been a portal to a swirling nebula, solidified. The depth vanished, replaced by the stained grey of institutional plasterboard. All around me, my gallery was coming undone. The towering metal sculptures softened, their joins liquefying. Girders untwisted themselves, plating unbent. With a series of metallic sighs, the components separated and fell, clattering into their original configurations. The polymer wing, the metal quarter, my curated piles of beautiful junk were being returned to me, piece by piece. The floor beneath my feet lost its warmth, the intricate silver lines of circuitry receding back into the composite, leaving the cold, scuffed surface I had known for years. In less than 10 minutes it was over. I stood in my apartment, my cluttered, dingy, perfectly ordinary apartment. I looked at the obsidian plinth. The cube was a flat, unmoving red. The cosmos within its surface had vanished. It was, to all outward appearances, just a strange block of crimson material. A chime came from the door. Frank, the superintendent. I took a deep breath, the air scraping my lungs. I smoothed my shirt, an absurd gesture of normalcy. I walked to the door. On the monitor, Frank's face stared back, impatient, his expression set in the permanent skepticism of a man who has heard every possible excuse. I pressed the panel to open the door, and it slid aside. He was a short, solid man who looked like he had been poured into his grey municipal uniform. "Took you long enough? Having a systems malfunction?" "No," I said, my voice sounding strained. "Just lost in thought." His eyes, small and sharp, bypassed me and swept the room. They lingered on the piles of scrap. I saw his lip curl in an expression of distaste. It was the best review I could have hoped for. "Right, thought," he grunted, stepping past me into the room. He held a small datapad, its screen glowing with a checklist. "Let's make this quick. I've got a whole floor of you people to worry about. Standard inspection, lighting." He glanced up. "Functional." He made a check mark. "Atmospherics." He sniffed the air. "Recycled as per spec." Another check. He walked a slow circle around the center of the room, his boots making scuffing sounds on the floor. His eyes catalogued my collection, dismissing it as the sad hoarding of a low-grade junk hauler. He saw nothing of value, nothing of beauty. He saw exactly what I needed him to see. He stopped in front of the obsidian plinth. His eyes fell on the red cube. My throat went dry. "What's this?" he asked. "Salvage," I said, the word coming out faster than I intended. "Just a piece of junk. Unusual polymer composite, probably a ballast weight from a luxury skiff. Worthless." Frank leaned closer, his suspicion coiled in the room like a waiting predator. He reached out a thick finger, aiming for the cube's flawless surface. "Don't touch it." The words flew out of my mouth. Frank's finger stopped, a centimeter from the cube's surface. He pulled his hand back slowly and turned his head, fixing me with a look of profound irritation. And why not? Panic sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The lie presented itself, fully formed, borrowing the language of my job. "It's reactive, post-conflict scrap. A lot of these private security firms use materials that are unstable. I ran a quick scan on it back on the scow. It leaches a low-grade neuroinhibitor on dermal contact." I held up my hand, letting him see the slight tremor. It was no longer a defect, it was an asset. Anything with an unclassified biosignature has to be handled with gloves until it's in a proper containment unit. I just haven't gotten around to it. Frank stared at my shaking hand, then back at the cube. His expression shifted from suspicion to the weary disdain of a man who has to deal with other people's hazardous messes. He took a half step back from the plinth. He was a man of rules and regulations. He wasn't paid enough to get a rash from some hauler's weird piece of trash. "Right," he grunted, making a final dismissive note on his datapad. "Contain it, and clean this place up, Clark. The statute on fire hazards is one I enforce with enthusiasm." He moved toward the door, his inspection complete. "And tell your friend Fisher to stop spamming the comms channel. Another wellness check and I'll be billing your account for my time." He was gone. The door slid shut and the silence of the apartment rushed back in. I leaned back against my workbench, the edge pressing into my spine. I looked at my hand, the tremor now pronounced in the aftermath of the adrenaline. It was my hand again. Clumsy, flawed, the hand of a man who could see beauty but never create it. And it had just saved us. I looked over at the red cube, sitting on its pedestal, an object of perfect stillness in a room of chaotic junk. It had trusted me. It had withdrawn its power, made itself vulnerable, and trusted me to handle the threat with the crude, messy tools of human deception. A partnership had been formed. I wasn't just its subject anymore. I was its protector. I walked over and picked up the small iron gear Orion had left. I placed it on the obsidian plinth, right beside the cube. A piece of a machine next to a piece of a god. An offering from one world, guarded in another. They looked right together. Over the next week, life returned to a semblance of its old rhythm, but the memory of the transformation had poisoned the well of my melancholy. The grey walls felt like a cage. The piles of scrap, which had once held a universe of promise, now felt like simple clutter. I would pick up a stylus and my hand would betray me with a shaky line, a clumsy curve. I went back to work. I had to. Another week of absence would trigger a review from a far more invasive process than Frank's cursory glance. I guided my scow through the rubble fields, sorting metal, my actions purely mechanical. My focus wasn't on the beautiful junk anymore. It was on the small, red cube sitting on my desk back home. A sleeping god I was now responsible for. After every shift, I would return and clean its flawless surface with a lint-free cloth, a ritual of stewardship I had invented for myself. It never responded. The true source of my anxiety lived on the public comms channel. Orion's posts continued. They had changed in character. The frantic, disjointed ramblings had been replaced by something more coherent, more poetic. He wrote of the geometry of silence and colors that exist behind the light. He was no longer a madman raving. He was a mystic trying to describe the indescribable. He was building a theology, and my door was his holy site. His words were getting more attention. A few other residents had started asking questions, intrigued by the strange beauty of his prose. He was drawing a map, and I knew that someone would eventually try to follow it. The alert arrived on a quiet evening, 3 weeks after Frank's visit. It was not a block-wide communication or a message from my employer. It came through a deeply encrypted channel on my private terminal, the kind used for secure financial transactions, not casual conversation. The sender ID was a string of alphanumeric code, untraceable. The message was text only, displayed in a clean, minimalist font. Mr. Leo Clark. My name is Lorian Croft. I am a consultant in aesthetic assets specializing in works of unique or unprovenanced origin. Information has come to my attention, fragmentary but compelling, suggesting an event of profound artistic significance may have occurred at your location. The descriptions speak of a compositional grammar and a material execution that are, to put it plainly, without precedent. I am not a regulator or an agent of any corporate authority. I am an admirer of the new. My sole interest is in witnessing, understanding, and, if appropriate, contextualizing singular works of genius. I propose a private viewing, at your convenience. My discretion is, like my appreciation for true artistry, absolute. I await your reply. There was no threat in the words. Not a single one. But the message was the most terrifying thing I had ever read. Frank had come to see if my apartment conformed to regulations. This man, Lorian Croft, was coming to see if my art was genius. He already knew. He was a predator who had heard a strange new bird singing in the jungle, and he was coming to see if it was worth putting in a cage. I read it a second time, and then a third. The words were calm, precise, and utterly terrifying. Aesthetic assets. That was the language of the core, of the unseen elite whose high-end refuse I sometimes found glittering in the rubble fields. It was the language of turning a soul into a stock certificate. Contextualizing. That was the most chilling word of all. It meant manufacturing a story, a brand, a market value. It was the opposite of everything I believed. I saw beauty where it existed, latent and ignored. This man, Lorian Croft, created value where there was none, a form of alchemy that turned truth into profit. Orion. It had to be. His whispered poems of singing light had travelled out of this block, through the station's data streams, and reached ears I couldn't have imagined. Ears that belonged to a man who didn't hear a mystic's prayer, but the ringing of a cash register. I moved to the terminal search interface and typed the name, Lorian Croft. The search yielded almost nothing. That, in itself, was a sign of immense power. People with real influence don't have public profiles. I found whispers. A name mentioned in the acquisition records for a private gallery on Cygnus X1, the very system that housed the institute that had rejected me. Another mention in a list of consultants for a Xenocorp executive's private art fund. He was a ghost who moved only in the highest, most rarefied circles. A man like that did not make contact on a whim. His fragmentary but compelling information was a surgical strike. To ignore him would be an admission of guilt. It would be an invitation for him to dig deeper, to apply pressure in ways I couldn't anticipate. My only option was to face him, to control the narrative. I had bluffed my way through an encounter with a bureaucrat. Now I had to face a high priest of a religion I despised. I opened a reply window and composed the message with a care I usually reserved for arranging pieces of my collection. Each word was a shield. Mr. Croft, your message is intriguing. I have recently come into possession of an object of unusual character. I would not be opposed to a consultation. Tomorrow, 1400 hours, Unit 7C12. I hit send. The message vanished into the network. There was no taking it back. A meeting was set. The door I had guarded so carefully was now one I had agreed to open. The next day, I tidied the apartment by composing the clutter. I arranged the piles of scrap into slightly more ordered stacks, a futile attempt to make my life's failures look like intentional aesthetic choices. I wiped down the plinth. I rehearsed my lies. The story I had spun for Frank felt flimsy, a child's fable against the coming storm. At 1400 hours exactly, the chimes sounded at my door. Not a second early, not a second late. The precision itself was a statement. I took one last look at the cube sitting there in its obstinate redness and opened the door. He was taller than I expected and slender. His clothes were a severe, minimalist black. There was no texture to it, no reflection. It was like looking at a hole cut in the shape of a man. His face was sharp, angular, and unnervingly composed. His eyes were the darkest part of him, still and analytical. They took in my work jacket, my worn boots, my entire existence in a single, silent appraisal that held neither judgment nor approval. It was the gaze of a scanner classifying data. "Mr. Clark," he said. His voice was calm, a low, measured tone that carried no echo in the narrow hall. "Lorian Croft, thank you for seeing me." "Mr. Croft," I replied, my own voice a blunt instrument by comparison. "Come in." He glided into the apartment. He did not look at me again. His attention was on the room. His eyes swept over the metal quarter, the polymer wing, the circuitry archive. Unlike Frank, he did not see junk. I could tell by the fractional pause, the shift of his head, that he was reading the room, analyzing the composition of my failure. And then he dismissed it. His eyes settled on the obsidian plinth in the center of the room, and all the clutter around it ceased to exist for him. He moved toward it. In one hand he rolled a small, perfectly polished sphere of black obsidian between his thumb and forefinger, the motion fluid and constant. He stopped before the plinth, his shadow falling over Orion's small gear. He said nothing for a long time. He simply looked at the cube, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to a piece of music only he could hear. I braced myself for the question, for the "what is it?" that would force my lie into the open. The question never came. "Subtractive manufacturing on a monolithic block," he said, his voice almost meditative. "But the tool marks are non-existent, even on a subatomic level. That suggests a form of molecular accretion, but the structure is impossibly stable. The color, it's not a surface treatment. It's a fundamental property of the material itself, a static chromostate." I stood frozen. He wasn't asking me. He was thinking aloud, narrating his own expert analysis. He was seeing everything. He finally turned his gaze from the cube to me. His eyes were full of a terrifying, intoxicating understanding. Most scavengers would have classified this as low-yield composite and jettisoned it into a reclamation furnace. A regulator would have tagged it as a non-compliant anomaly and had it incinerated. But you didn't. You saw it. You looked at this object, which defies every known principle of fabrication, and you recognized its true nature. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You have an extraordinary eye, Mr. Clark." The praise landed. It was the first half of the sentence from my rejection letter, the part that had always been the cruel prelude to the failure that followed. He had no idea how precisely he had aimed that dart. "It's just an interesting piece of salvage," I managed to say, the lie sounding pathetic even to my own ears. "I thought it might be worth something to a collector." Lorian smiled. It was a small, bloodless thing that did not reach his eyes. "Worth something? Mr. Clark, an object's worth is a story we agree to tell. Rarity, provenance, artistic intent. These are the pillars of value. This object has no story, it has no known artist, it has no history, it is, in its current state, worthless." He took a step closer to me. The scent of his clothes reached me, something expensive. "And that," he continued, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, "is what makes it the most valuable object I have seen in my entire career. It is a blank page, and we, Mr. Clark, we are the ones who will write on it." His words hung in the air, a perfectly constructed sentence designed to bypass all my defenses and appeal directly to the core of my failure. He was offering to write a new story, one where I wasn't a man with extraordinary vision, but technically deficient. I would be the man who simply had extraordinary vision. The technical part would belong to the object, but my name would be on the cover. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, a denial so weak it felt like a surrender. "I'm just a hauler who got lucky." Lorian's placid smile didn't waver. He waved a dismissive, elegant hand, as if clearing away my pathetic attempt at self-preservation. "Please, Mr. Clark. Humility is a virtue, but in the face of an artifact like this, it is a liability. You and I are the only two people on this station who can look at this object and understand its potential. Do not insult our shared perception by pretending otherwise." He began to move around the room. He didn't look at the junk anymore, but he spoke of it. "Let me paint a picture for you. The story is already written. Leo Clark, the salvage artist, a man with the soul of a sculptor, forced by circumstance into the grime of the galaxy's forgotten corners. He spends his life surrounded by broken things, searching for a single perfect form. And then one day, he finds it. His gaze landed on me, sharp and penetrating. It's a beautiful story. It's a myth, and myths are the foundation of all value. He produced a datapad from an inner pocket of his black coat. It was a thin slate of smoked glass that came to life in his hand. He extended it to me. "This is a contract," he said, his voice dropping to a business-like pitch. "It's an exclusive partnership agreement. My resources, my network, my security. I will handle the logistics, the marketing, the contextualization. I will ensure your name is celebrated in every major gallery from here to the core. You will have a life of unimaginable comfort, free from the roar of reclamation furnaces and the stench of recycled air forever." He held the datapad out, waiting. I didn't take it. "And what do you get?" "A commission," he said smoothly. "A percentage. A significant one to be sure, but a fraction of a fortune is still a fortune. And more importantly, I get the privilege of introducing the next great artistic movement to the galaxy." "There is no movement," I said, a new strength hardening my voice. "There is just the cube." "Exactly," Lorian said, his smile widening. "And you are its prophet. What good is a god without one? Think of it, Leo. Your only responsibility is to create. I will handle the rest." I looked at the glowing screen of the datapad. It held a vision of a life I had only ever allowed myself to dream of in my darkest, most private moments. A life of respect. A life where my vision was not a curse, but a gift. Everything I had ever wanted, offered to me in a perfect, glittering cage. My hand trembled as I reached out and took the datapad from him. The glass was smooth beneath my calloused fingers. On the screen, at the bottom of a wall of elegant text, a single word flashed. "Accept." Lorian Croft stood in silence, watching me. He didn't pressure. He was a master of his craft, and he knew he had constructed the perfect offer. He had laid out my entire existence, identified its single point of failure, and presented a flawless solution. He had seen me, and he had offered me a mask I desperately wanted to wear. My thumb hovered over the screen. I thought of the rejection letter. Extraordinary vision, but technically deficient. This contract would erase the second half of that sentence. It would validate the first. Then, my eyes shifted past Lorian, past the datapad, to the plinth. I saw the small iron gear Orion had left. A humble offering of sincere, uncalculated reverence. Orion hadn't seen an aesthetic asset. He hadn't seen an opportunity for contextualization or a chance to build a myth. He had seen a miracle, and it had filled a void in his soul. He wasn't trying to sell it. He was trying to be worthy of it. What would happen to the art, the real art I had witnessed, in Lorian's hands? It would be photographed, catalogued, given a serial number. It would be leased to corporate lobbies. It would be traded by investors who would never once stand before it in simple, honest awe. Lorian wouldn't be sharing its beauty. He would be caging it, turning a living thing into a commodity. He would be taking the god I had seen and rendering it down for parts. The art wasn't mine to sell. I was its protector, not its owner. My life's great tragedy was not that I was a failed artist. It was that I was being asked to be a successful salesman. I lowered the datapad. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. Lorian's placid smile did not falter, but surprise and disappointment passed through his dark eyes. It was gone in an instant. "I see," he said, his voice retaining its perfect, measured calm. "You are a purist. I can respect that. Perhaps my initial offer was too commercial. We can renegotiate my commission. We can build in clauses that ensure the integrity of the work." "It's not about the commission," I said, holding out the datapad to him. "It's not for sale." He did not take it. Everything is for sale, Mr. Clark. It's simply a matter of finding the right currency. You live in a Class G HAB unit and sift through scrap for a living. Forgive me for assuming your currency was credits. I placed the datapad on my workbench, next to Orion's flower. The contrast was stark. The transactional promise of the machine against the simple, fragile beauty of the living thing. This object, I said, gesturing to the cube, isn't an asset. It's something else, and I have no right to put a price on it. Lorian finally moved. He took a slow step back, his composure flawless, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. A regrettable decision, he said, his tone still even, but now edged with something sharp. You are choosing poverty and anonymity out of a misplaced sense of romanticism. An artist cannot create in a vacuum, Mr. Clark. The universe is a loud, dangerous place. An unprovenanced artifact of this power will not remain a secret for long. It will attract attention, not from admirers like me, but from others. People who see a tool, not a work of art. People who will not ask for a private viewing. He turned and walked toward the door. You need a protector. You have just refused the best one you are likely to find. He paused at the threshold, his hand on the panel. I will withdraw my offer, but my interest remains. I wish you luck with your purity. I suspect you will need it. And then he was gone. The moment the door slid shut, I was moving. There was no time for contemplation. His threat wasn't a possibility. It was a promise. I went straight to my terminal and began to search. The first attempts were useless. Keywords like anomalous artifacts, matter-rearranging technology, and sentient sculpture ran into walls. Corporate firewalls from Xenocorp blocked access to their materials science archives. Military-grade redactions blacked out entire swaths of data relating to post-conflict salvage. The public network was a carefully curated garden, and I was looking for a plant that was not supposed to exist. I was thinking like a technician, like a hauler. I needed to think like an artist, like a lunatic. I deleted the scientific terms. I typed in new words, words from mythology, from the stories I'd found on bootleg data slates as a kid. Skyweaver's loom, ordeal of the silent god, soul forges. The searches returned streams of esoteric nonsense, fragments of dead religions and philosophical tracts from 1,000 worlds. It was a flood of data, but this time it felt different. It was the right kind of noise. I was sifting through the galaxy's spiritual junk now. Then, a hit. It was a reference buried deep in a footnote of an obscure academic monograph titled Archetypes of Creation in Non-Carbon Species. The paper was from a university that had been defunct for a century. The footnote cited a primary source, the Codex of the Glass-Singers of Xylos, a glass-bone tablet that supposedly told of entities who judged worlds by the beauty of their songs. The phrase snagged in my mind. I dug deeper into the monograph's metadata. The author was a man named Caspar Lerner. There were no recent publications, no academic appointments. He was another ghost. But the paper mentioned that a fragment of the codex was held in a private collection he curated. The Museum of Vanished Voices. The museum was not listed on any official Port Xylos directory. It was a place that did not want to be found. But embedded in the source code of the old academic file, almost like a watermark, was a string of corrupted data. It looked like a fragment of a navigational coordinate, a sublevel, an unzoned sector of the station known for its disused infrastructure. I had a breadcrumb. I looked at the red cube on its plinth. I could not leave it. It was the source of all of this. And if Lorian's others came looking, this was the first thing they would take. I found a padded container, the kind used for shipping hypersensitive sensor arrays. I placed the cube inside, nestled it securely, and sealed the lid. I slung the container's strap over my shoulder. The weight was negligible, but the responsibility felt immense. For the first time since this began, I left my apartment with no intention of coming back soon. I stepped into the corridor, not as a resident, but as a man seeking asylum, on his way to find a librarian of dead gods. The public transit tube, an artery of Port Xylos, carried me away from the residential shell and deep into the industrial ring. The holographic ads flashed past, selling luxury upgrades and corporate security solutions. They were transmissions from a world that had ceased to have any meaning. I clutched the strap of the container hanging at my side, a physical anchor in a reality that felt increasingly fluid. My datapad guided me to a service hub I had never used before, a functional grey intersection for maintenance crews and cargo drones. I stepped out of the tube, earning a passing glance from a pair of synth fabricators in oily coveralls. They dismissed me as another cog in the wrong part of the machine and moved on. The coordinates from the old academic file led me away from the main thoroughfares, down a series of narrow, little-used service corridors. The bright corporate lighting gave way to caged, yellow emergency lamps that hummed with a weary inefficiency. The station's clean, polished skin was peeling back, revealing the old iron and rust-stained conduits beneath. I came to a heavy blast door stenciled with a faded warning. Decommissioned Sector 34 Gamma, no access. The door was sealed, but beside it, a maintenance panel hung open, its wires spilling out like metallic entrails. The datapad's navigation signal pointed directly behind it. Tucked in the darkness of the alcove was a simple iron ladder, descending into a square of absolute blackness. The only way was down. I swung myself onto the ladder, the container with the cube bumping against my back. The rungs were slick with a fine layer of condensation. I descended into the dark, leaving the hum of the station above me. My boots hit the floor with a splash. I activated my datapad's illuminator, casting a thin, nervous beam of light into the gloom. I was in a vast utility tunnel, wide enough to have once serviced massive cargo transports. Pipes thick as my body lined the walls, weeping rusty tears. The floor was a patchwork of metal grates and shallow pools of dark water. The coordinates led me forward, deeper into the underbelly of Port Xylos. After a 10-minute walk through the dark, the signal on my datapad solidified. It pointed to a section of the tunnel wall that looked no different from any other. A flat, featureless sheet of dark metal. There was no sign, no handle. If it weren't for the insistent blinking icon on my screen, I would have walked right past it. I ran my hand over the surface. Nothing. It felt solid. My beam traced the edges. In the upper right corner, nearly invisible under a layer of grime, was a tiny symbol. It looked like a stylized sound wave. I reached out and pressed my thumb against it. There was no sound, but a vertical line of light appeared in the wall, thin as a hair. The line widened as a section of the wall slid silently inward, revealing an opening into a space that was even darker than the tunnel I stood in. It smelled of old paper and dry air. I stepped through the doorway, and the door slid shut behind me, sealing me in absolute blackness and silence. A voice, soft and dry as old parchment, spoke from the darkness ahead. "You are either very lost or you have a story to tell. Which is it?" A frantic pulse pounded in my ears. The voice was calm, but the darkness was absolute. "I have a story." The words felt rough and unused in my throat. One by one, golden lights began to flicker to life around me. The light didn't come from a single source, but from dozens of small, ancient-looking lamps scattered throughout a cavernous space. The darkness receded, revealing not a room, but a labyrinth. It was a chaotic, beautiful maze of towering shelves, stacked display cases, and tables cluttered with artifacts. There were no priceless minerals, no advanced technology. Instead, a holographic projector cast the image of a towering bone tree onto a high ceiling, its branches whispering an epic poem in a language of chimes. Prayer drums made from the shells of some massive insect sat in a circle, their surfaces worn smooth by 1 billion forgotten benedictions. Stacks of data slates, dusty scrolls, and glowing memory crystals were piled everywhere, a library of cosmic folklore. The owner of the voice stood by one of the tables. He was a stooped figure, lost inside a moth-eaten wool cardigan that looked as old as the artifacts around him. A cloud of thin white hair created a wild halo around a face etched with the fine lines of deep thought and a gentle, abiding amusement. Thick, archaic glasses magnified his eyes, and behind the lenses they were shockingly bright, curious, and alive with the light of stars. "Then you have come to the right place." He gestured to a worn chair beside a table piled high with what looked like star charts printed on synth parchment. "This is the Museum of Vanished Voices. We traffic in stories here, please." I sat down, but I couldn't rest. I leaned forward, the desperation that had been building for days threatening to spill over. "I don't know where to start," I said. "I found something, an object, and it changed everything." The old man, Caspar Lerner, just watched me, his eyes patient and unnervingly calm. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened, an act so rare in this galaxy that it felt like a form of grace. The story came out in a torrent. I told him about my job, my collection, the discovery in the rubble field. I described the object, its perfection. I told him about waking up to find my home transformed into a gallery, the art composed from my own junk with a genius that was both divine and horrifying. I told him about the change in my own body, the unearned skill that had invaded my hands, and the fog that had returned when the art vanished. I told him about Orion's desperate worship and Lorien Croft's predatory offer. Through it all, Caspar listened. His expression never changed from one of deep, serene attention. He seemed to absorb the tale as if it were a weather report, a familiar pattern he had observed many times before. When I finally ran out of words, I slumped back in the chair, exhausted. The silence in the museum settled around us again. "And the object," Caspar said, his first question precise and gentle. "The one you found. Can you describe it?" "It's a cube," I said, my hand going to the container at my side. "Small, perfectly smooth, red." At that, a change finally came over him. His bright eyes widened slightly behind his spectacles. A hint of profound recognition lit his face. It was the look of a historian who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle he'd been studying his entire life. He leaned forward, his hands resting on a stack of ancient scrolls, his voice dropping to a near whisper filled with an academic awe. "Ah," he breathed out, the sound a mix of reverence and pity. "So the test has begun again." "Test?" The word felt small and inadequate. "What test? What are you talking about?" Caspar gestured for me to open the container. My hands fumbled with the clasps. I pulled out the cube and set it on the table between us, next to a fossilized seed pod. The cube's flat, crimson surface absorbed the golden light of the museum. "I have never seen one," Caspar whispered, his eyes locked on the object. "But I have read the accounts, dozens of them scattered across 1,000 cycles, from species that have long since turned to dust. The stories change, the language shifts, but the pattern is always the same." He looked up from the cube. "You are not the victim of an anomaly, Mr. Clark. You are a candidate." "A candidate for what?" My voice was tight with a frustration that bordered on anger. I had come here for answers, and all he was giving me were more questions. "For a trial," he said, his tone still gentle but now imbued with a deep gravity. He rose from his chair and shuffled over to a towering shelf, his fingers trailing along the spines of ancient data slates. The glass singers of Xylos called it the ordeal of the silent god. A silicon-based race from the Galactic Rim referred to it as the Skyweaver's Loom. The names don't matter, the function does. It is a form of contact. It is a summons. He pulled a thin tablet from a shelf and carried it back to the table, handling it with the reverence of a priest holding a holy text. "The stories say that an ancient intelligence, a power so vast it treats galaxies as gardens, periodically seeks out new forms of beauty. It believes a universe without new art is a universe dying of sameness, so it sends out probes, Tools, catalysts. He gestured to the red cube on the table. It finds a species, a world, and it looks for a certain kind of mind, he continued, his eyes distant, as if he were reading from a script only he could see. It looks for someone with profound vision but limited ability, a soul that can recognize sublime beauty but cannot create it. It finds a frustrated artist. He looked at me then, and his understanding was absolute. He wasn't speculating. He was telling my own story back to me. Then the trial begins, Casper said. The first stage is always the same. It takes what the candidate has, their scraps, their pigments, their jumbled notes, and it creates a masterpiece, a demonstration, a lesson in what is possible. He pointed a thin, ink-stained finger at me. The test is not whether the art is beautiful. The test is whether the candidate recognizes it as such. Most fail here. They react with fear, with greed. They try to destroy it or sell it. He paused. You, Mr. Clark, reacted with awe and jealousy. You passed the first test. The breath left my lungs in a slow hiss. The chaos of the last few weeks was snapping into a terrifying, logical sequence. The transformation of my apartment, my own biological improvement. It was a curriculum. The man who came to see me, I said, the words tumbling out. Lorian Croft. He wanted to sell it. He wanted to build a myth around it. Of course, Casper nodded. The second test. The test of intent. What will the candidate do with this newfound miracle? Will they protect its purity, or will they trade it for worldly power? You sent him away. You passed again. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the ancient wood of the table. Passed? What happens if I fail? What is this all for? Casper's expression grew somber. The stories that end in failure are always quiet. The artifact simply reclaims its creations and vanishes, leaving the candidate and their world in silence. The gardeners move on, marking this patch of soil as fallow, unworthy of cultivation. His eyes held mine, and I saw a universe of lost stories reflected in them. And what is it for? That is the question of the final test, Mr. Clark. The masterpiece. The artifact has shown you what is possible. It has given you the skill. Now, it will fall silent and wait to see what you will do. It is not looking for a perfect copy of its own work. It is looking for something new, something it could not have conceived of itself. He picked up Orion's small iron gear from where I had set it down. It is looking for a synthesis, its perfect alien technique filtered through your own flawed, messy, beautifully human soul. That is the only thing you have to offer that it does not already possess. The words settled in the quiet air of the museum. Everything I had been, the failures, the frustrations, the quiet, aching loneliness, was not a liability to be erased. It was the only thing of value I had to contribute. As the understanding took root, a hum filled the room. It emanated from the table between us. The red cube was no longer inert. The flat crimson surface was alive again, shimmering with the internal nebulae of light I had seen in my apartment. It was not waiting anymore. It was demanding. At the same instant, a current ran through me. It started in the base of my spine and shot up into my skull, a jolt of pure clarity. The fog that had clouded my mind for a week vanished, burned away by a clean white light. I held up my hand. The tremor was gone. It was perfectly, absolutely still. But this time, it did not feel like a violation. It felt like a tool being returned to a craftsman who finally understood its function. The fear was gone, replaced by a terrifying, boundless sense of purpose. The apprenticeship is over, Casper said. He took a reverent step back, away from the table, his role as guide complete. He was now just a witness. The canvas is yours. I looked around the museum. My eyes, now instruments of perception, saw it anew. It was no longer a collection of dead things. It was a palette. The prayer drums resonated with the ghosts of a million desperate hopes. The scrolls held the fragile light of forgotten philosophies. The holographic projector that cast the Bone Tree poem held a narrative of life and decay. This was my new collection, and its potential was infinite. I could create anything. A sculpture so flawless it would make a mathematician weep. I could replicate the cube's own alien genius and create a work of sublime, inhuman beauty. And I would fail. Casper's words echoed in my mind, something it could not have conceived of itself. Perfection was a dead end. My eyes drifted past a stack of star charts and landed on a simple dark object on a display stand. It was a weeping stone, from a species that communicated through shared sorrow. A polished rock that would grow warm when held by someone in pain. My own pain. The sting of rejection from the Institute. The ache of my solitary shifts in the scow. The crushing weight of my own inadequacy. That was my medium. My unique contribution to the cosmic symphony. I walked to the table and picked up the cube. It felt warm in my new, steady hand. Then I turned and walked toward a large, clear space on the floor of the museum, the holographic projection of the Bone Tree flickering above me. This would be my workshop. I did not start with a grand gesture. I began with the most human thing I could imagine. I reached for a sliver of a broken prayer drum, a piece of cracked plating from the Glass Singer's Codex, and a single dead memory crystal. I arranged them on the floor. A composition of brokenness, of failure, of hope. I held the cube over them. And then, with all the skill of a god and all the pain of a man, I began my masterpiece. There was no conscious thought, no blueprint. The design flowed not from my mind, but from a deeper place, a well of feeling I had spent my life trying to ignore. I held the cube, and it became an extension of my will. I did not lift a finger. I guided the flow. The shard of the prayer drum liquefied, its solid form dissolving into a ribbon of resonant sound made visible. The cracked tablet surrendered its internal light, which I wove into the ribbon of sound. The dead memory crystal at the center did not come to life, but its complex dormant structure became the anchor, the seed around which the new form would grow. Matter obeyed. Not my touch, but my intent. Casper watched from the shadows, a silent, unmoving witness. My work expanded. I drew more from the museum's vast library of sorrow and hope. I pulled a sliver from the weeping stone, and its latent warmth spread through the burgeoning structure, giving it a core of gentle, shared pain. I took the metallic chime of the Bone Tree poem and forged it into thin, delicate filaments that branched and reached, never quite connecting, the very shape of longing. A sculpture began to rise from the floor. It was a structure of grace, a web of captured light and solidified sound, held together by a logic that was both mathematically perfect and emotionally fragile. It was beautiful. It was flawless. It was a perfect echo of the cube's own alien aesthetic. And it was a lie. This was imitation. This was the work of a student who had mastered his teacher's style perfectly. This was a failure. I looked at the beautiful, perfect thing I was creating. It was soulless. It held none of my own story. The image of the rejection letter flashed in my mind. Extraordinary vision, but technically deficient. For a single, agonizing moment, I was tempted to finish it this way, to prove that I was no longer technically deficient, to create one perfect thing in my life, even if it meant failing the test. No. My focus narrowed. I found the central column of the structure, a perfectly spiraling pillar of woven energy. It was the heart of the sculpture, its strongest and most beautiful element. And with a singular act of will, a surge of all the frustration and pain I had carried for 32 years, I broke it. There was no sound. The pillar simply fractured along a single line, a clean, undeniable wound that ran through the heart of its perfection. It was an intentional flaw, a scar. It was the crack in the foundation that proved the building had lived. It took the sublime, inhuman beauty of the sculpture and made it tragic. It made it mine. The energy flowing from the cube ceased. I lowered my hand, the connection severed. My work was done. I stepped back. The sculpture stood in the center of the museum floor, a thing of breathtaking grace with a broken heart. It was the most honest thing I had ever made. The cube in my palm grew still. The internal nebulae of color slowed, then stopped, coalescing into a single point of brilliant, steady white light. It was a light of pure, neutral assessment. Then, the masterpiece on the floor dissolved. It did not collapse or shatter. It turned into a cascade of shimmering particles that flowed from the floor into the cube, absorbed into the single point of white light. It took my offering. It accepted my story. The light in the cube softened, then faded completely. It became once again a simple, inert block of red material, a weight in my palm. The power receded from my body, the perfect stillness draining from my hand, leaving the comforting tremor in its wake. I was just Leo Clark again. The cube warmed in my hand one last time, and then without a sound, without a flicker of light, it dematerialized. It simply ceased to exist. I stood in the sudden, profound emptiness of the silent museum. Casper shuffled forward out of the shadows, his ancient eyes soft with something I couldn't decipher. "So," he said, his voice gentle, "it is done." I stood there, my hand still outstretched, feeling the phantom weight of the object that was no longer there. The silence in the museum was deeper now, an emptiness where a universe had just been. "I failed," I whispered, the words small in the vast space. "It took the art and it left." "No, Leo," Casper said, his voice soft but firm. He shuffled closer, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the sculpture had been. "You didn't fail. You succeeded. You gave it something it didn't have. It didn't leave because you were unworthy. It left because its work here was done." I looked down at my hand. The tremor was back. It wasn't a curse anymore. It felt like my own signature. "But the skill is gone. I'm me again." "Yes," Casper said, a faint smile touching his lips. "And that is the entire point. It wasn't a gift of power. It was a lesson. It taught you a new language. Now you get to spend the rest of your life speaking it with your own voice, your own accent." He gestured around the museum. "All these stories, the ones that end in silence, are the ones where the candidate either tried to keep the power or failed to add anything of their own. The stories that end like this, with the catalyst departing, they speak of a new season, of a quiet change in the wind." A profound sense of peace settled over me. "What now?" I asked, looking around the museum. "What do I do?" "You go on," Casper said simply. "You take the lesson you were given, and you go on." He gestured back toward the dark doorway I had entered through. "Your apartment is waiting. Your collection is waiting." My collection, the piles of junk. But it wasn't a museum of failure anymore. It was a quarry. It was a stockpile of raw materials, of beautifully flawed and broken things waiting for a pair of flawed, human hands to shape them. The work would be hard. My lines would be shaky. My sculptures would be imperfect. But they would be mine. "Thank you, Casper," I said. The words felt insufficient for what he had given me. He had been the only person in the universe to offer me a map. "The story was a good one," he said, the twinkle returning to his eyes. "I am grateful to have heard it." I turned and walked back toward the silent, dark doorway. I did not look back. I stepped through the portal, from the sanctuary of myth into the mundane world. The door slid shut behind me, and I was alone in the utility tunnel, the beam of my datapad cutting a small, determined path through the darkness. I was walking back to my old life, but I was not the same man. I knew now that the gap between vision and execution was not a void of failure. It was the space where art was born. A few months later, my apartment is a disaster. It is the most beautiful mess I have ever known. The metal quarter and the polymer wing are gone, their formal titles dissolved. In their place are workbenches cobbled together from salvaged plating, surfaces covered in tools, wire clippings and dust from polished composites. Sculptures in various states of completion occupy every available space. They are small, humble things. A mobile made from the iridescent shells of beetle drones that twists slowly, its balance imperfect but graceful. A mosaic of shattered data chips whose cracked surfaces, when they catch the light just right, form a picture of a ship disappearing into a star. I am working on a new piece, a small bust forged from the melted-down plating of a security drone. It's meant to be a portrait of Casper, but my hands, my own clumsy, flawed hands, can't quite capture the serene wisdom in his eyes. The mouth is a little crooked. The lines on his face are too deep. It is a failure in a dozen different ways. It is also the best thing I have ever made. My fingers, still prone to the occasional tremor, trace the flawed line of the jaw. The skill is no longer borrowed. It is earned, one shaky line at a time. I set the tool down and checked the public comms channel for Block 7C. For years it was a stream of bitter complaints and maintenance requests. Now, it's something else. One resident has posted a short, simple poem about the way the light from the transit tube reflects in a puddle of spilled nutrient paste. Another has shared a holophoto of a complex frost pattern on an external viewport. Someone has started a thread dedicated to the found music of the station, the rhythmic clang of a cargo loader, the harmonic hum of a life support system. No one calls it art. It's just a new kind of seeing, a quiet awakening that is spreading through the block like a slow, warm tide. I put on my jacket and step out into the corridor. I don't dread it anymore. It's just a space between places. I walk toward the small public atrium at the center of our block, an area with a few benches and a hydroponic planter that always seems to be failing. And that is where I see him. Orion Fisher is sitting on one of the benches. He is no longer a data clerk. His employment record shows he quit 2 months ago. In front of him, on the floor, he has arranged a small collection of found objects. A discarded bolt, a smooth stone from the hydroponic bed, a sliver of brightly colored wire, a single shed beetle drone carapace. He nudges the bolt a few millimeters to the left with his finger, his head tilted, his face wrapped with a silent, focused joy. He is composing. He is making a universe out of forgotten things. He looks up, and his eyes meet mine. There is no manic worship in his gaze anymore. There is no desperation. There is only a simple, calm recognition, a shared understanding that passes between us without a single word. He is not my disciple. He is a fellow artist. He gives me a small, quiet nod, and then his attention returns to his work, to the profound importance of placing a single stone in its perfect, temporary place. I walk back to my apartment. The crooked, imperfect bust of Casper is waiting for me on the workbench. There is so much to do. There is so much more to fail at. The door slides shut behind me. I pick up my tool and I get back to work.